we are at the brink and probably already in a phase of the world where the change we're seeing is rapid and dramatic and won't be incremental anymore. And I want to show you how this pans out in the world. And the basis for this is, and I mentioned earlier to you, this notion of exponential technology. It's kind of a weird word. It's a little bit of a made-up word we came up with at Singularity University. But really what we're talking about is these exponential trends. Exponential trends are, the easiest form to explain them is typically you double every time period. So you stack up these trends which have this like weird hockey stick curve. So they start out very slowly and then they go very, very steep very quickly. The most important and probably best known exponential trend is Moore's law. So here in Silicon Valley, Gordon Moore, who's one of the co-founders of Intel, predicted 50 years ago, pretty much exactly 50 years ago, that the number of transistors on a square inch of an integrated circuit will double every 2 years. This is the reason why when you take out your iPhone today, so someone just took a picture of me with their iPhone, your device, your iPhone device, and this is not an exaggeration, has more compute power for the $800 you pay for it than NASA had total to send the man on the moon. Not just like a computer, all of NASA's compute power is now in your pocket and then some, $800. This is the reason, this is a classic exponential trend. Now there's something interesting happening and we're calling this the linear exponential deception. Let me explain this. So technology moves exponentially. We see this in computers, but we see this in many, many other technology areas as well. So you see it in, today you see it in artificial intelligence, robotics, synthetic biology, energy systems, solar power, yada, yada, yada. Now, we as humans have grown up over the last 150,000 years in a world which is linear. Like the seasons come and go, you know, harvest comes and go. Every winter, the saber-toothed tiger tries to kill us. So really our world has evolved in a linear fashion. So our thinking, our intuitive thinking has evolved in a linear fashion. And let me show you how this plays out. We're calling this the linear exponential deception. Imagine you take 30 steps. So I take 30 steps linearly, one after the other. 30 steps is, as someone who grew up in Germany, 30 meters. If you're an imperial, you're at 30 yards, roughly. That's easy to understand. I have a very intuitive sense how far that is, probably from here to the end of the room. I also have a very intuitive sense how far half of that is, for example. Now imagine you take 30 exponential steps. So every step is twice as far as the step you did before. Now I know that you can all pull out your computers and you can even probably do this in your head, and you can do the math on this. But ask yourself, like, what is the intuitive answer you would give to me, which comes to your head, like pops into your head? Now, typically, if I ask a room, this is a little bit too big a room to like do this interactively, but if I ask a room, like the typical answers, and you can check this with yourself, is if you're brave, you say it's a mile. Now, in reality, it's 25 times around the planet. It's 1 billion meters. So you go from 30 meters to 25 times, just because you're moving from a linear to an exponential trend. Now, let me show you how this plays out in the world. There's something called information growth. This is data which Eric Schmidt and the Wendy Schmidt Foundation, so Eric Schmidt was the former CEO of Google, they were interested in information, obviously because it's Google, it's a topic for them. And they determined that if you were to take all the information mankind has ever produced until the year 2003, so literally you take the cave drawings our ancestors did, you take the Library of Alexandria, you take the great works of Beethoven, etc., 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 and you were to digitize them. This is a number which comes up as information. It's about 5 exabytes. It's a very big number. Now, the same amount of information, not quality, it's quantity, okay? The same amount of information we produced in 2010 in roughly 2 days. All of mankind's information compressed down in 2 days. Now, in 2013, we already produced this in 10 minutes. I can guarantee you that today, by the end of every single sentence, we as humans produce the same amount of information we produced since the beginning of dawn. This is a classic exponential trend. Now, it goes the other way around as well. You look at cost. So this is a downward exponential trend. You take the cost as an example of DNA sequencing. The first time we decoded the full human genome was part of the Human Genome Project, completed in 1999, took us 7 years. if you take all the costs which went into this, it's about a $3 billion endeavor. Incredible feat for mankind to take the human genome, decode it, 7 years worth of work. Now, in 2006, we did this for a couple of $1 million. $10 million took us a couple of months. So we're already going from like orders of magnitude downwards. Last year, a company out of San Francisco called Illumina built a machine which looks like a really big photocopier. And they're decoding a full human genome, the full string of a human genome, in a few hours for $1,000. So within 15 years, you go from something which only nation states can possibly even think about doing to something you can actually do in a hospital today. Now you speak to our experts, and this is the so what here, you speak to our experts who are in genomics, and you ask them, so what do we make out of this? They will tell you that price will come down in the next 10-ish years to pennies. Sequencing the human genome will be free. Now, what do you do with this? Simple. One thing is, we literally have a picture, one of our faculty has a picture of a toilet bowl. Every time you flush the toilet will sequence the genome and gives you a full health report. Because you get it for free. Why wouldn't you? Now here's the scary side of technology, because technology always goes in kind of weird ways where it's like it's good and it's bad and technology doesn't really care. But here's the scary side. You're currently shedding cells. Like you're losing hair follicles, you're losing skin cells. The moment you all leave this room, BSR will hoover up this room and create a full genomic fingerprint of every single person in this room. And you can't do anything about it. True story, the President of the United States, when he travels to rogue states, the Secret Service is actually hoovering up behind him. It's a true story. So this is what happens on exponential trends. Now there's an interesting thing. We talked a little bit about this idea of like we are, as humans, we're really hardwired to think linearly. So now if you map linear versus exponential trends and you look at this curve, there's like 3 really interesting points. The first is, because exponential trends start out so slowly, there's a point where we want technology to be here and in reality it's here. And this is what is called disappointment. This is where we are dismissing technology. This is when you look at Google Glass, classic example. You look at Google Glass and you say, wow, it's $1,500, way too expensive. Battery life is terrible. Functionality is really not that great. And oh, by the way, you look like a dork wearing it. So you're dismissing it, right? But then something interesting comes. You come to this point where Steve Jobs gets on stage and shows the world for the very first time the iPhone. And you're looking at your Nokia phone and you're like, this thing is not a phone anymore. Right? You got the crossover of these lines. This is the point when like everything changes. And then you come into a world where you come into chaos and amazement. This is where you cannot keep up with the change anymore. So take mobile phones. Kenya's cell phone penetration, smartphone penetration today is 7%. So they have about 90-ish% cell phone penetration. 7% of those are smartphones. In 3 years, that number is going to shoot up to 90%. In 3 years, all of Kenya is on the internet. Now, we talked to, for example, Barclays Bank, which is a big bank down in Kenya. They will tell you that if they are not on mobile phones, banking on mobile phones in 3 years, they're gone. They're just disappearing as a bank. So this is what the power of these trends. Now, the challenge is big corporations, big organizations typically stay on this linear path. Nokia being a really interesting and good example, Kodak being the other one. If you stay there, this is your path to doom. Because you become irrelevant, you become displaced by someone else. Let me show you this in another graph. This graph needs a little bit of explanation. It's my favorite graph of all times. This comes from Ray Kurzweil, who's one of our founders. He's one of the leading engineers at Google. He's one of the, if not the, most authoritative person to talk about artificial intelligence in the world. So what Ray did was, there's an argument to be made to say, well, these exponential trends are actually not exponential. What they do is they're S-curves. They flatten out. So take, for example, Moore's Law. So Moore's Law is true for 50 years. But we're now coming to a point where the distance between transistors is about 6 to 7 nanometers. So the smallest distance you currently produce, produced by Intel, by the way, is 6 to 7 nanometers. If you go to about 2 to 3 nanometers, physics don't work anymore because you've got electrons jumping between the transistors. So Moore's Law will flatten out. Now, he was interested in, like, what does this actually mean? So what he did was he came up with a different calculation. He said, well, if we look at something, you can only count transistors for the time there are transistors, obviously. So he came up with a different calculation saying, if we count how many calculations can I produce per second if I were to spend $1,000 of that year's time? So it's kind of like a crude approximation for compute power. And then he went for a 110-year period through the different technologies. And what you see is this is a logarithmic graph, so that's the reason why you're not seeing it as an exponential, but as a linear graph. What you see is that effectively what Moore's law stipulates is true for 110 years. And the reason for that is simple. Because what happens with technology is you've got these S-curves, but they stack on top of each other and create a perfect exponential. So in this case, you start with something like mechanical computing. Mechanical computing got replaced by tubes. Tubes got replaced by transistors. Transistors got replaced by integrated circuits. Integrated circuits will get replaced by quantum computing or biocomputing. We don't know yet which another paradigm is coming, but we see that these trends stay stable. Here's the reason why I love this graph. First of all, it shows that these trends are stable over time, over long periods of time. The second is, and now you can do some fun stuff with this graph. The second is, if you take the delta between the lowest and the highest point in the graph, it's 10 to the power of 15, that's the delta. That happens, according to Wikipedia, to be the amount of ants living on the planet. Fun tidbit. More importantly, if you take the smallest point on this curve, which is at 10 to the power of minus 5, and you would draw this, and it's 1 inch high, the highest point on the curve, which is in the year 2010-ish or so, that highest point would be 66,000 times to the moon. This gives you an idea of like what the increment in change is we have had in compute power, in raw compute power. Now, here's the really crazy part about this thing. If you believe, there's a big if here, if you believe this to be true into the future, you can actually extrapolate the moment, because you can draw the curve, the moment when you will have a computer which has the raw compute power of the human brain, which will happen in the year 2029. So in the next 15 years, we will see a computer which has as much compute power as the human brain. Now, more interestingly, you can actually extrapolate this even further out. Now we're coming into the realm of like crazy. But follow me along. In the year 2060, so a year I probably will not see anymore, but like my children will, we will have a computer which has the raw compute power of every single human on the planet. Single machine, all of the human planet's compute power.